Were you excited to be on TV, Grandma?
Yes, I was.
Hi, my name is Grandma Betty, and this is Grandma Betty's Recipes. Now, I did not grow up in the mountains myself, but my grandmother did, and that woman could feed 12 people on what most folks today would throw in the trash before Tuesday. She had a saying, "Waste is a sin, but a bad meal is worse." Every single trick in this video came from women like her.
Women who learned to cook, not from television or the internet, but from watching their mothers and grandmothers move through a kitchen like it was second nature. Like the cast iron skillet already knew what to do, and they were just showing up to help. Before grocery stores sat on every corner and kitchen gadgets filled every drawer, families tucked into the hollows and hills of Appalachia were cooking some of the most resourceful, delicious food this country has ever seen. They had no fancy equipment, no cooking shows, and absolutely no patience for wasted food. What they had was generations of hard-won kitchen wisdom, passed down through whispers and wooden spoons. And here is the thing that might just surprise you. Most of those old hillbilly cooking tricks, they flat out work better than anything you will find in a modern cookbook. Trick 1. Season your cast. Iron with Crisco and salt. If you have ever cooked on a cast iron skillet that sticks like a guilty conscience, somebody did not teach you this trick. Mountain families had no non-stick cookware. What they had was cast iron, and they treated it like the family heirloom it was.
The secret was plain: Crisco and coarse salt. Rub the Crisco in, work the salt across the surface, then bake the pan at 350 degrees for an hour. The fat bonds permanently into the iron, building a surface that gets better every time you cook on it. Those women knew something the non-stick pan industry hopes you never figure out.
Trick 2. Put a slice of bread in your brown sugar. At some point between last Tuesday and this morning, somebody's brown sugar turned into a small, edible brick. You know exactly what I am talking about. You reach into the pantry, grab the bag, and what comes out could patch a driveway. Mountain kitchens had this problem too, but they solved it with something they always had on hand: a single slice of white bread tucked right into the bag or container of brown sugar, sealed up tight, and left overnight. By morning, the bread had surrendered its moisture to the sugar, pulling those hardened crystals back into soft, workable, scoopable brown sugar, without a single lump remaining. The science is simple, even if nobody back then was calling it science. Sugar is hygroscopic, meaning it pulls moisture from whatever is nearby. Dry air hardens it. Introduce a moist surface like fresh bread, and the sugar greedily absorbs just enough to soften back up. The bread itself ends up hard as a cracker, having given everything it had for the greater good. You can also use a few marshmallows or a slice of apple for the same effect. But bread was what mountain families had in every kitchen every single day. No special tools, no trips to the store. Just a heel of bread doing honest work in a sugar bag. My grandmother did this her entire life, and I never once saw her throw away hardened brown sugar. Come to think of it, I never saw her throw away much of anything. Trick 3. Bacon grease as a universal flavor base.
If hillbilly cooking had a mascot, it would be an old tin can sitting beside the stove with bacon grease in it. Every mountain kitchen had one. Every single one. After cooking bacon in the morning, that rendered fat did not go anywhere except into that can, where it waited patiently for its next assignment.
And its assignments were many. Bacon grease was the cooking fat for fried potatoes, the flavor base for green beans, the shortening in biscuit dough, and the seasoning for cast iron all at once. Modern cooks reach for olive oil, butter, chicken stock, and smoked paprika to build flavor layers. Hillbilly cooks reached for the bacon can and got all of that in one scoop. The magic of bacon grease is in what it carries. When you render bacon, the fat absorbs all of the smokiness, the salt, and the deep pork flavor from the meat. That flavor does not disappear when the bacon is gone. It sits in that grease, concentrated and ready, waiting to be deployed into the next dish that needs some soul. Green beans cooked in water taste like green beans. Green beans cooked with a spoonful of bacon grease tastes like something worth driving to a church potluck for. Cornbread made with bacon grease in the skillet develops a bottom crust that crackles when you cut it. Fried potatoes cooked in bacon fat develop a flavor that no amount of butter or oil can replicate. The can on the stove was not laziness. It was a flavor library that never closed. Trick 4. Soak wild game in salted water. Overnight squirrel, rabbit, venison, groundhog. Mountain families ate what the land provided, and the land did not always provide something that tasted mild coming out of the woods. Wild game has a strong, distinctive flavor that can overwhelm a dish if you do not know how to handle it before it ever hits the pan. The hillbilly solution was elegantly simple: a long soak in cold salted water, sometimes overnight, sometimes for a full 24 hours. Drew out the blood and much of the gamey compounds that made wild meat taste, well, wild. The salt acted as a mild brine, penetrating the muscle fibers and pulling out myoglobin, that dark blood compound responsible for the strongest wild flavor, while simultaneously beginning to tenderize the meat from the outside in. Some families added a splash of vinegar to the soaking water for extra effectiveness, particularly with older animals whose flavor was more pronounced. After the soak, the water would run dark and the meat would emerge noticeably milder, more tender, and ready to absorb whatever seasonings you cooked it with. This trick works just as beautifully today on store-bought chicken or pork. Soak chicken pieces in cold salted water for an hour before frying, and you will get noticeably juicier, more flavorful results. Mountain grandmothers did not know the word brine. They just knew it worked, and they kept doing it. Trick 5. Corn cob smoke or backyard BBQ flavor. Here is one that is going to make the backyard grill masters pay attention. Before liquid smoke existed in a bottle, and before specialty wood chips were sold at hardware stores, mountain families were already getting deep, rich smoke flavor into their meat, using something stacked behind the barn in enormous piles: dried corn cobs. After the corn was shelled off for grinding or animal feed, those cobs got saved because they burned slow, hot, and clean, with a smoke that was slightly sweet, slightly nutty, and absolutely perfect for flavoring meat. Dried corn cobs produced a smoke gentler than hickory, but more complex than apple wood. Mountain ham smoked over corn cobs had a flavor that entire communities recognized and sought out. Today, dried corn cobs are available online and at farm supply stores, or you can save the cobs from your summer corn and dry them in the sun. Free flavor from something you were going to throw away anyway. That is about as hillbilly as it gets, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. Trick 6. Stretch ground beef with oatmeal. Before we go any further, I need you to stay with me on this one, because I can already hear some of you getting ready to close the video. Just wait, just listen. During the Depression years and well into the middle of the 20th century, ground beef was expensive enough that a single pound had to stretch across multiple meals for large families. Mountain cooks discovered that mixing plain rolled oats directly into ground beef for meatloaf, for meatballs, for hamburger patties stretched the meat significantly without noticeably changing the flavor. The oats absorbed the beef juices and fat during cooking, swelling into the meat mixture and becoming virtually indistinguishable from the meat itself in terms of texture. A meatloaf made with 1 pound of beef and a half cup of oats fed more people than a meatloaf made with a full pound of beef alone. And it was actually moister because the oats held onto every bit of juice the meat released during baking. The trick was using old-fashioned rolled oats, not quick oats, and mixing them in dry so they had time to hydrate from the meat's own moisture during cooking. Some families seasoned the oats separately with onion powder and garlic powder before mixing to ensure the flavor distributed evenly throughout.
This was not desperation cooking that tasted like desperation. This was smart, practical cooking that produced genuinely better meatloaf. My grandmother never made meatloaf without oats, and I did not even know it until I was 30 years old and asked her for the recipe.
Trick 7. Leftover biscuit. Dough as pot pie crust. In a mountain kitchen, leftover biscuit dough did not sit in the refrigerator getting ignored until it turned into a science experiment. It had a job, and that job was pot pie crust. Whether you had leftover chicken from Sunday dinner, the last of the vegetable garden coming in at once, or just a can of mixed vegetables and some chicken broth, that biscuit dough could transform humble filling into a complete, respectable meal that looked like it took planning. The dough would get rolled out flat and laid across the top of whatever filling was in the cast iron skillet or baking dish, edges pressed down to seal in the steam. 20 minutes in a hot oven, and the biscuit dough puffed up golden and flaky, forming a crust that was actually better than a standard pie crust for this purpose because it was thicker, more tender, and soaked up the filling juices from underneath while staying crispy on top. The genius was in understanding that biscuit dough and pie crust dough were not so different that you had to treat them like strangers. Both were fat and flour and liquid. Both responded to heat the same way. Hillbilly cooks did not see separate recipes as separate worlds. They saw ingredients as flexible, interchangeable, useful in more ways than any one recipe suggested. Nothing in a working kitchen belonged to only one dish. Trick 8. Storing eggs in lard to keep them fresh for months. Before refrigerators reached every hollow, keeping eggs fresh through summer was a genuine survival problem. Chickens do not lay on a convenient schedule, and a good spring flock produced far more eggs than a family could eat immediately. Mountain families solved this with larding. Freshly laid, unwashed eggs got packed into a crock and submerged completely in rendered lard. The natural coating on an unwashed egg, called the bloom, combined with the lard to create an airtight seal that kept oxygen and bacteria out for months. The lard could be reused afterward, having lost nothing in the process. Old knowledge, modern application. Oxygen is the enemy of freshness, and mountain grandmothers figured that out long before vacuum seal bags existed. Trick 9. Sweeten cornbread with creamed corn.
There has been a border war running since approximately 1945 between Southern cooks who insist cornbread should never contain sugar and Northern cooks who put enough sugar in theirs to qualify as cake. I am not going to take a side in that conflict today because I enjoy sleeping peacefully at night. What I will say is that mountain grandmothers had a third option that settled the argument beautifully.
They added a small can of creamed corn to their cornbread batter instead of sugar, and the result was cornbread so moist and subtly sweet that nobody was asking whether it was the right kind or the wrong kind. They were too busy eating it. Creamed corn added natural sweetness from the corn itself without the refined sugar taste that divides cornbread loyalists. More importantly, it added moisture that kept the cornbread tender for days instead of turning into dry crumbles by the following morning. The corn particles in the creamed corn also added a slight texture variation throughout the bread, giving each bite something interesting to discover. This trick required no extra skill, no additional techniques, just the substitution of one ingredient for another based on what was available, what was affordable, and what tasted better. Hillbilly cooking was not about following rules. It was about understanding what you were trying to achieve and finding the most practical path to get there. Trick 10. Make gravy in the same pan as everything else. I want to take a moment to appreciate the fact that mountain grandmothers raised enormous families while doing all of their cooking on a wood-burning stove with basically no counter space, and usually one source of water that had to be hauled in. Under those conditions, the idea of dirtying a separate pan just to make gravy would have gotten you laughed right out of the kitchen. Gravy happened in the same pan where the meat had just cooked, and that was not a compromise. That was the correct way to make gravy, and modern cooks who dirty extra pans are, I say this with love, doing it wrong. After frying chicken, pork chops, or a skillet of hamburger patties, you had a pan full of brown drippings, caramelized meat bits stuck to the bottom, and rendered fat, all of which contained more concentrated flavor than any store-bought broth could dream of providing. You sprinkled flour directly into those drippings, stirred it into the fat until it turned golden, then added milk or water or stock slowly, scraping up every bit of those browned bits as the liquid hit the pan. Those stuck bits, which French cooking calls fond and hillbilly cooking calls the good part, dissolved into the gravy and transformed it from a sauce into a whole experience. Rich, complex, deeply savory, and made entirely from what was already in the pan. One pan, one skillet, maximum flavor. That is the whole philosophy right there. Trick 11. Boil potatoes in their skins. Mountain families did not peel potatoes before boiling them, and this was not because they were cutting corners. It was because they understood something that took nutritional science considerably longer to confirm. The skin of a potato is where a significant portion of the flavor lives, and the skin acts as a natural barrier that keeps the potato's starch and moisture from dissolving into the cooking water. A potato boiled in its skin stays firmer, tastes more like potato, and retains more of its natural nutrients than a peeled potato dropped into boiling water. Once cooked through, the skins slipped off easily in your hands, and you were left with potatoes that were dense, flavorful, and perfectly textured for mashing, slicing, or eating with nothing but a little butter and salt. The skins themselves, once removed, did not go to waste. Fried in bacon grease with salt and onions, potato peels became their own side dish that children fought over. If you have never eaten fried potato skins cooked in bacon fat on a cast iron skillet, I am genuinely sorry for the gap in your life experience. Go fix that this weekend. Trick 12. Keep cornbread soft with a wet cloth. Cornbread has a betrayal problem. You make it. It comes out of the oven beautiful and tender. And by the next morning, it has turned into something you could use to level a fence post, Mountain families did not accept this because they made large batches of cornbread that needed to last for multiple meals, and throwing it out was simply not something that happened. The solution was a damp cloth laid directly over the cornbread while it cooled and continued during storage, not soaking wet, just wrung out damp, draped over the top of the skillet or the pan. The cloth created a slightly humid microenvironment around the cornbread that slowed the rate of moisture loss from the crust, keeping the interior tender while still allowing the cornbread to breathe enough that it did not get soggy. This same principle explains why grandmothers kept their bread boxes lined with cloth, and why old cookbooks recommended storing baked goods under a dish towel rather than sealed in an airtight container. Airtight creates moisture buildup and eventual sogginess. A breathable cloth keeps things soft without trapping condensation. Modern plastic wrap solves one problem and creates another. The damp cloth trick solved both and required nothing you did not already have in the kitchen drawer. Trick 13. Use coffee as a meat tenderizer. In a mountain household, the morning coffee pot never got poured down the drain. It had a second career, waiting as a meat tenderizer and flavor booster. Tough cuts of beef or wild game, soaked in cold leftover coffee for a few hours before cooking, came out genuinely tender because the acidity broke down tough muscle fibers the same way vinegar does.
Added directly to a pot roast with onions and salt, coffee produced one of the richest gravies imaginable. This trick never went away. It just moved from mountain kitchens to restaurant menus where they charge you extra and call it espresso rubbed something or other.
Trick 14. Drop a raw potato into oversalted soup. Every cook who has ever cooked has made soup or beans that were too salty. Every single one. You get distracted, you add an extra pinch without measuring, you use saltier bacon than usual, and suddenly your pot of beans could preserve a side of pork on its own merits. Mountain cooks had a fix for this that required no additional ingredients, no complicated techniques, and no admitting to anybody that you had made a mistake. You peeled a raw potato, cut it into a few large chunks, and dropped it into the over-salted pot for about 15 to 20 minutes of simmering. The raw potato absorbed a noticeable amount of the salt from the surrounding liquid, pulling it out of the soup and into the starch of the potato itself. You fished out the potato chunks before serving. They were not meant to be eaten, having sacrificed themselves for the greater good. And the remaining soup was measurably less salty and perfectly rescuable. Does it pull out every bit of excess salt? No. Is it a miracle? Not exactly. But it pulls out enough to make the difference between a pot of beans that is too salty to enjoy and a pot of beans that is perfectly seasoned. And nobody ever needs to know anything happened. The potato is the most discreet helper in any mountain kitchen. It shows up, does its work quietly, and asks for nothing. Trick 15. The tin can grease system. Let us revisit the bacon grease tin can for a moment because it deserves its own full entry. This wasn't just a container, it was a system. In mountain kitchens, a clean, empty tin can, usually a coffee can or a vegetable can, sat permanently beside the stove. Every time bacon was cooked, sausage was fried, fat back was rendered, or any fat-producing meat hit the skillet, the leftover grease got poured through a small strainer into that can while it was still hot and liquid. As it cooled, the grease solidified into a creamy, ivory-colored fat that kept safely at room temperature for weeks. There was a constant rotation. New hot grease went in on top, Older grease got used from the bottom, and the can was washed out and started fresh every few weeks to keep the flavor clean. The system predated sustainability as a concept by about a century. Nothing was wasted. The fat that came off breakfast bacon seasoned the green beans at lunch and fried the potatoes at dinner. One cooking session feeding the flavor of 3 meals. Modern cooks pay a premium for artisan lard and specialty rendered fats that mountain families produced as a natural byproduct of just cooking their regular meals. The tin can was not a sign of poverty. It was a sign of intelligence. Trick 16, mayonnaise as cake moisture. This is going to sound wrong and taste right, which is a combination Hillbilly cooking specialized in. Mountain families discovered that adding a few tablespoons of mayonnaise to chocolate cake batter produced a finished cake so moist it barely needed frosting. Mayonnaise is simply eggs and oil, the same 2 ingredients most cake recipes call for separately, but pre-emulsified in a form that distributes through batter more evenly than either ingredient added alone. The mayonnaise flavor disappeared completely during baking, leaving nothing behind except tender, moist cake. Hellmann's eventually printed this recipe on their jar labels because their customers had already figured it out and they wanted the credit. Trick 17. Add vinegar to pie crust for flakiness.
The great pie crust myth is that the secret to flakiness is cold butter and ice water and a light hand with the mixing. Those things matter, but mountain grandmothers who made pie crust twice a week for their entire adult lives had an additional trick that pushed their crusts into a different category altogether. A teaspoon of white vinegar or apple cider vinegar added to the ice water before it went into the flour and fat mixture.
The acid in the vinegar inhibited the development of gluten in the flour. Gluten, when overdeveloped, makes pastry tough and chewy rather than tender and flaky. By introducing acid into the dough, mountain bakers created a crust that was far more forgiving of mixing and handling, staying tender even if you worked it slightly more than you should have. This meant that on a hot summer day, when your hands were warm and the kitchen was not cooperating, your pie crust still came out beautifully. The vinegar also contributed a barely perceptible tang that played beautifully against sweet fillings like apple or peach, adding a subtle complexity that people could taste but could never quite identify. Ask someone what made their grandmother's pie crust different, and they will tell you they do not know. It was just better. The answer is probably sitting in a bottle of vinegar in their pantry right now. Trick 18. Cool butter in well water. Before electric refrigeration reached into the mountains, keeping butter fresh through summer was a daily challenge. Butter left on a counter in July turned rancid within hours. Mountain families with access to a well or a cold running stream used those cold water sources as natural refrigerators, submerging crocks and containers of butter in the cold water, where temperatures stayed consistently cool year-round, regardless of what the air temperature was doing outside. A crock of butter, wrapped in cloth and lowered into a well on a rope, could keep fresh and firm for days, even in the height of summer heat. Families built spring houses directly over cold springs for exactly this purpose, using the natural cold of underground water to preserve butter, milk, cream, and other perishables without a single piece of electrical equipment. The principle behind this trick, that cold water, is an efficient heat sink that absorbs and carries away warmth from whatever is submerged in it, is the same principle behind modern water-cooled systems in computers and industrial equipment. Mountain families were doing passive cooling engineering out of pure practical necessity. And they were doing it successfully enough that their butter tasted fine and their families stayed healthy. The well rope had more jobs than just bringing up drinking water. Trick 19. Use your cast iron lid.
Cast iron earned its heirloom status partly because one piece of it could do the work of 6. The lid of a large cast iron Dutch oven, turned upside down over heat, became a perfectly functional griddle for flatbreads, pancakes, eggs, or thin slices of meat. The raised edge kept food from sliding off, while the iron distributed heat evenly across everything on it.
One Dutch oven with its lid meant you could fry, bake, boil, stew, simmer, and griddle everything a family needed from a single piece of equipment. Mountain families traveling light-packed exactly this combination. Soldiers in the Civil War era did the same thing for exactly the same reason. Trick 20. Add baking soda to beans. We have made it to Trick 20, and I saved this one for last because it is arguably the most useful thing in this entire video, and also the one that nobody ever talked about at the dinner table because polite company did not discuss what happened after dinner. A pinch of baking soda, and I mean a small pinch, a quarter teaspoon at most for a large pot, added to a pot of dried beans during cooking, neutralized some of the complex sugars called oligosaccharides that are responsible for the digestive discomfort that follows a bean-heavy meal. Mountain families ate beans constantly because beans were cheap, filling, nutritious, and could be stored dry for years without spoiling. A family eating beans 3 or 4 times a week in a small cabin in the mountains needed every available trick to make that situation more comfortable for everyone involved. And the baking soda trick was passed down through generations with the quiet efficiency of genuinely useful knowledge. The baking soda also had the secondary effect of softening the beans faster and making them more tender throughout, because alkaline conditions break down the cell walls of legumes more quickly. Your beans cooked faster, came out softer, and caused considerably less trouble later in the evening. The small print on this trick is that too much baking soda will make your beans taste slightly soapy, so restraint is important. A pinch, not a spoonful. Mountain grandmothers knew the difference, and now so do you. 20 tricks, 20 pieces of knowledge that kept families fed, comfortable, and resourceful across generations of hard living in the American mountains. None of these required expensive equipment.
None of them demanded culinary training or specialty ingredients. They demanded observation, memory, and a willingness to use what you had, rather than wish for what you did not. That is the whole philosophy of hillbilly cooking, distilled into a single sentence. And it is a philosophy that produces genuinely good food in the hands of people who respect it.
I am Grandma Betty, and this has been Grandma Betty's Recipes. If you learned something today, even just one trick that you're going to try this week, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button down below so you do not miss what we uncover next. We have got decades of forgotten kitchen wisdom left to dig through, and I promise you, we're just getting started. Leave me a comment telling me which trick surprised you the most. My guess is it was either the mayonnaise cake or the baking soda beans. It is always one of those two. And if you have a hillbilly cooking trick of your own that your grandmother passed down, share it below because some of the best things I have ever learned came from the comments section. See you next time.